Kia ora and welcome to the Hockey New Zealand Exploring Coaching podcast. These podcasts are an exciting opportunity for our local coaches to hear from experienced hockey people about all things coaching. Our intention is that you'll pick up what you like and give it a try for yourself, hopefully fueling your own development in our great game. Today we're going to be talking about what matters most, looking at the key element that underpins the development of individuals and teams. To find more information about coaching in our podcast, head over to the Hockey New Zealand website and click on the Get Involved in Coaching tab. Follow the links from there and you'll have everything you need. With that said, settle in and enjoy the podcast. Welcome back to another episode of Exploring Coaching. My name is Jamie Carroll and I will be your facilitator for today. Lucky enough to be joined by my two friends, Butcher and Mark Borgers from Hockey New Zealand. Today we're going to be talking about what really matters. It's a huge question, and hopefully click the link to find out what we've been scheming for you all today. But generally, what we're going to talk about is team culture, why together is better, and I'm going to pick these boys' brains about just what that actually means and how we might implement that in the future into our trainings and team environments. So, gentlemen, welcome. Bright and early on a Monday morning. Looks like both of you have had coffee, which is fantastic. So it's a pretty open question. What really matters the most?
I think last time, Mark, when we did this on a Monday morning, you handballed to me. So I think it's how teams work, right? It's your turn.
Yeah, that's a fair call. So I'll just have to bear that one. What matters most? Well, what matters most is the athletes. And when you work in a group, it's the group. The group formed out of those athletes, but they're all individuals with their own personalities, idiosyncrasies. Great word. If you need to understand those people, those persons, but you also need to understand the energy of them being together, working together, and those are two different things. So if we talk about sport, I would summarize it: the human being, but also the group, and start there. And that has nothing to do with actually any hockey.
I really like the together word sort of frames it for me. I'd probably start this conversation with, I think the quote goes, culture eats strategy for breakfast every day. And there's no doubt that culture is a massive component of how teams function together and how you harness that togetherness. But I think if we talk about culture, it's sort of the way we do things. It's the rituals, the routines, the symbols that sort of tie everyone together on the same story and journey, if you like. But I think there's another layer as well, which will hopefully sort of lead into what we're talking about, which is about how connected that group are. So the culture's good. You know, most teams that are good they play together, they try to play together, and they have an agreed way of sort of operating, the way they play, and and so forth. But I think the great teams, they have another layer on top of that, where there's a connectedness, and there's lots of places we can take that. But I think that's the starting sort of conversation for me.
Yeah, that's interesting, because there you talk about levels, and that's what I like. I think there's always a culture, whether you want to call it a good one or a bad one. That probably depends on the values that you have or the outcomes that you want. But each culture or group culture seems to go through certain phases, whatever you want to call them. There are theoretical models for that, but it's also your experience as a coach that could, well, identify that. That could lead to some sort of understanding of that. And I think if you start to understand those levels, those different levels, then you also know what kind of leadership or what kind of role you have as a coach, because you cannot apply the same actions for each level.
Yeah, and I think that the culture is also, there's sort of two streams from that as well. There's the sort of not that you're trying to enforce it, but the sort of manufactured culture where you have your meetings and you talk about values and you try and figure out how you create some sort of cultural infrastructure, whether that grows in that direction that you've agreed to. And then there's the culture that just is, because there's a culture in place whether you talk about it or you try and cultivate it or manufacture it already. And so I think one of the really key things is to understand, the people you've got and how that creates whatever culture is already there and work with that. So I think understanding those two streams is quite important.
Yeah, but what do you do then if the culture, according to you as a coach, needs change or transformation? Maybe that's a better word, or needs to be renewed completely, and that's where the challenges come in, because I think we would all agree that if you come into a culture and you start to understand this is not the way we're gonna succeed together, you cannot just pretend you're this elephant and you're gonna ruin everything that's there and wipe everything off the table and start over again, unless you have the full buy-in from the players. So what I learned over the years, it's a mistake to just take on any team that you don't know. It would be very wise to watch a few training sessions, watch a few games, maybe talk to a few players, get to understand them first as good as you can, and then maybe land on, hey, where are we sitting right now, and how can we move from here on, and what is my role in that, or could I play a role in that, something like that. But just starting from scratch on is, without any prior knowledge, would be unwise, I would say.
Yeah, I think we've got two conversations. One is the culture, and then one is maybe this connectedness or cohesion around how groups work together. But in terms of culture, there's no doubt you have to have an understanding of all the things that sort of feed into a group as you become part of it in the role that you have. And, there's things like legacy, the history, the short-term history of that team. Maybe last year they lost a grand final. There's all these things. And we can talk about this for an hour in itself, the things that lead into what is their current culture. But I then think, and I sort of keep learning this every time, it's an ongoing thing, that you can't really learn who your group is and what culture is and the sum of, I guess, the context of all that until you live amongst them. So it takes time. So you've got to take a long-term approach to culture change or culture enhancement or wherever it is you think it's at, because I would argue no matter how much homework you do, videos, statistics, meetings, read the club's history, whatever it is, you still don't really know until you're part of the group. And it will evolve as that understanding grows over time.
I personally find this the most contradicting and difficult thing in my job, the thing that you just mentioned, because it takes time. But then if you work in a performance environment, and even community is performance, because we want to win the next game, everyone does. So sometimes those two can contradict each other. On the one hand, you try to understand the culture by living amongst them, what you were just saying, Butch, and by understanding them, and by feeling what motivates them and what connects them and all those things, and that takes time. But then there's the next game in 7 days, and and that requires a different approach. That requires going back to the strategy board, draw on the whiteboard how we can maybe beat the next opponent. And that's also important, because actually whatever happens there on that day, winning or losing, with a poor or a good strategy, could actually help to form that culture. So they're interdependent as well.
Yeah. And it's not black and white. And I think the thing we often try to do is we come in and try and make a statement that we're professional, or we care about what we're doing, or we're a good leader, or that this is the priority with the group. And we go too hard with the process of this is our culture, when it just doesn't work that way. So I think there's a balancing act of coming in and saying, look, these are the things that I think are important because of this. this is what I understand about where we're at and who we are. And so these things are important, but we've got to grow and evolve together to consolidate that, because it's not going to be real me going, this is it, or let's have a process of meetings and this is it, because it just becomes a document that means nothing. So having the patience and an approach where you are communicating and working with the group that this is going to evolve, and we don't need black and white yet, but we need an understanding that we keep working at hard together. I think that's the art of trying to get that right, so that it means something and it actually becomes who they are and who they need to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. What do you think is the absolute must? What do you need in order to create that? For me, it's a constant open conversation. What is it for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got to put in place systems, processes, things that you do as a group where that is part of the story. So it's not just training, and it's not just the usual things we do. There are activities or interactions or things that you create to keep finding things that are emerging in terms of that understanding of who we are and who we need to be.
Look, I love this, and this is a great topic, because I wonder how many teams go on a team trip without any hockey. I know from the Netherlands, where I'm from, that this is a common standard. Twice a year, you go a few days away, a week away, and this is where it really happens. And you don't bring your stick, absolutely not. And I've been doing the greatest things in my life with my squads. I mean, just one example. I brought my squad on camels to the Sahara Desert in Morocco, and we played there a game of hockey against some nomads. Well, that's gonna do so much more than 20 practice or test games. We spent the night with those nomads in their tents, and actually we had a good few drinks. And is that professional as a coach? We would say no, it's not. But if you look at the culture and what it does and what it creates, it bonds. It's you build relations there that last longer than just that one season, and it also, what it does is that people want to fight for each other. They want to fight for you. They want to take that next step, and then we talk about the next level.
Yeah, there's no doubt for me that those shared experiences and those things outside of the hockey bubble, they definitely help you create culture in terms of understanding, and a process of trying to get to that point about who we want to be. But I also think that goes to the next conversation around the difference between culture and having a group that are really connected, because those shared experiences and those things outside of hockey where you're sharing your life stories and you're spending time together, and then when you go back to training, you've got this shared thing which is quite unique. We're on camels, we're in this, and that bonds a group because it's theirs and only theirs. So I think that sort of activity or experience goes across both those things: building your culture, understanding yourselves, but also starting to create that connectedness.
What's the importance?
Just jump in there.
Yeah. Sorry, there you go, Jamie.
We're covering a heap of cool topics. There, gents. I just I wonder how we can make this relevant for a new school coach or someone that's just walking into a coaching position. Obviously, you guys have had a lot of experiences of joining new clubs or new performance teams and things like that. But if we kind of take this back to the purest form of a brand new coach or a secondary school player that's going to coach a junior team, how can we give them, I don't know, just a higher level of thinking when they start to approach this team culture? What are some of the real basic things that maybe we might look at before chucking a big vision at them, or your personal coaching philosophy?
For me, it's to start to have an open conversation with the athletes about values, what they value, what they think is important. And out of those values, or that value session or conversation, the next thing could flow, and that's maybe the norm or the standard. I don't like the word rule. As soon as you start to work with rules and policies, then that feels like a force. So yeah, that's probably where I would start.
I think the other thing I would add to that is I think you've got to have patience, and it might take a bit of, I don't know, courage or experience, but I sort of think now when you come in, and I learned this a bit this year, or I guess it reinforced it for me, that sometimes the best thing to do is to empower the group to start things off the way they think they should be. You know, how do we warm up? What sort of things do you want to do at training? And you sort of, from that, you'll get a quick understanding of what the current culture is and what they accept and how they think things should be done. And that gives you some really good information to then figure out how hard or soft or what your approach will be with the things that you need to change. And also, and I made this mistake with one of the teams I coached this year for probably a month longer than I should have, but if you really reflect on the things that they do, instead of knee-jerk going, and this is the example of one of the teams that were quite social and disorganized and didn't start training well, and where I tried to clamp down and talk to them about the fact we were wasting time, we weren't focused. And then I understood that the soul of the team and the reason they love this team and why they've been so good, it was also part of the problem, but it was also their strength. It was their DNA. So taking that away from them instead of finding solutions to harness that was the wrong approach. So you've got to have some patience and really try and cue into what's happening and why is it happening and what are the good things and what are the bad things, I think, before you start tampering with trying to influence cultural change.
There is a challenge. There's a challenge though, Butch, when you talk about the group, because in the group exists of individuals, and you have individuals with stronger personalities and individuals with, well, softer personalities, so to say. You need both. But if you're gonna open the floor, the stronger always take over first. So I think when we start to ask them, how would you like to warm up? How would you like to deal with this? What do you value? All that stuff. Then it is important as a coach that you do make sure that you know that every individual contributes to that process.
I think that's one of the learnings, though. I agree 100%, but I think that's one of the learnings, because I wouldn't even, or I don't even ask them. I just say, guys, let's just warm up. Let's just do what you've been doing. We're going to focus on some other things first. And you don't fob it off, but you just go, look, you guys know how to warm up, get it done. Straight away, you see who are the strong personalities. If you watch really closely, who don't really engage in it, who goes through the motions, and then you can see what they're doing. And that gives you some starting information where you can start trying to figure out the context of why these things are all in place. And it could be strong leaders that have opinions that they've basically hammered everyone else into submission with, because that's how they like to do it. But you can see all those things if you observe closely enough, and then, you know, ask questions, and just over a shorter, as long as it takes, period of time, learn with them why these things are so, and what things you think you need to try and influence change with, and what things you think are really important for them.
Yeah, I agree, because there's the natural hierarchy that is important too. There's always a hierarchy. It's not that everyone is equal in a group. That's an illusion. So, yeah.
Cool. So the observation piece initially is really important. So taking the time to observe and think about what you said, Butch, was some of the strengths, maybe some of the areas that you can use to accentuate those strengths, and then start to pull together the other stuff and figure out really what makes that team tick is probably a good takeaway for a new coach. Cool. Moving a little bit into the future now. So I think one of the traps that a lot of coaches get stuck in is that short-term mindset of, oh, we've got to go fix the technical, tactical stuff. They go to a training, they observe, they go, oh, Jimmy and Johnny can't trap. He can't hit upright. Oh, this is a shambles. And then they go ahead with their brush and shovel and try and fix all of those things. What are some of your thoughts around that approach and the effects that might have on the group?
I think it depends on your group. You know, like if you're talking about junior teams, then there's lots of things that are important, right? Like they got to learn how to play positions, they got to learn how to play together. We talked a bit about this the other day, but really your basic skills are king, because if you don't have them, you can't play the game. And so you've got to sort of still assess where your group's at, technically, tactically, what their age group is, where have they come from, what have they been involved in before, do they play other sports? There's all this information that you need to sort of try and gather and to process to make those decisions. So I think, and I don't want to make this sound too big and too complicated, but the more you gather that information and sort of hold the course of just processing all that first versus going this and this, I think is really important.
Yeah, there's also the tendency that you start to focus on the negative, the things that are not well, which directly creates a different atmosphere. One, I would say, I prefer to balance the positive and the negative. I don't like to say the negative, but the work-ons. I also hope if we talk about school coaches that they do work with some sort of long-term athlete development plan that is given by their director of sport, or at least some sort of plan to work from. So there is already a framework. If you start to talk more about high performance, then I think it's something you also discuss with the players. Like, hey, they need to really buy in the things that we need to repair, so to say. So yeah, it depends on the group. That's what Butch said as well. But yeah, don't. At least I would advise don't stare yourself blind on the things that don't go well. That's a negative.
And the positive sort of comment is really important, Mark, right? Like the science is really clear how people react to, positive feedback and stopping things when things are good versus constantly going, we've got to get better at this, we've got to get better at this. Here's your list of things you're not good enough at. Like that approach it probably hasn't changed too much, but it's a little bit archaic, where the science is really clear about, giving people attention and giving them positive affirmation on the things that they're good at and the things that they're doing well that you want to connect to how the team played. So having the right lens and the right language and the right balance with that stuff is really important with everything you do. Planning, competition.
Yeah, it helps confidence levels too. If you only focus on the negatives, then my confidence would drop. If you tell me constantly what I'm not good at, if you tell me you're really good at this and this and this, but we're going to work on this as well, that's fine. It doesn't do anything with my confidence levels. So I think that's a really important part if you start to create and work on a culture as a coach, because you're dependent on a positive attitude. Although there are also cultures, in all honesty, that actually create success based upon fear. So there is a model that works, although we all know it's not sustainable, and they leave people with scars and wounds behind.
Yeah, I really believe that one of the things that's important to include into the culture part that you infuse into the group is that you reward and you highlight and you praise like what people are good at, and you try and encourage them to get better at those things. So there's a culture of, this is what we value about you and this is what you're good, and you try and bring that into how the team plays and how they operate. I'm a massive believer that it's not only a more positive way to go, but people react off that better because there's some freedom for them to be what they want to be and what they feel good about and what they're good at. But the approach allows them to feel like they're also contributing to the group and not being oppressed or sort of pushed into compliance with this game plan that doesn't allow them to do the things that they're good at and that they love doing.
The flow-on effect for that is that the rest of the group will be striving to get that praise from you, and so it has a wider effect on the group as well if you're praising people for the things they're good at rather than picking on the things that they've got deficiencies in. So Julia, she just done an amazing trap and distribution around the back or something, and you praise her for that, then Monica's going to want to do the same kind of thing, or she might go a little bit harder on the next thing. So the flow-on effect of that approach is really positive for the group. And if you keep that consistent throughout your messaging and your trainings, games, it's really going to help the wider group in a long-term kind of way, and that helps build your culture as well. Like people are lifted up for doing something well, rather than pushed down if they do something not so well.
I also think it shapes who you are as a player. Like I can clearly still remember some teams and coaches where the coaches operated like that. It's a bit like that machine gun coaching. You're playing a small game and it's like, Butch, good, got your head up early, and there's this constant stuff. And I think of the different teams, or when I was really loving hockey. It's a long time ago, so maybe memories are a bit murky about what they grab a hold of and remember. But I remember certain coaches and certain teams that shaped how I played in a number of different codes or sports, because I was praised for doing certain things, and it became, in the AFL, I was sort of known as a hard, tough defender. Things like courage, tackling, and so I would get that reward that everyone said, "Oh, you're really good at that," or "I got praised for it," and it became who I was as a player. Now, is that totally positive? I'm not sure, but I went on that path because of what I was getting rewarded for and how people spoke about the way that I played.
It's interesting. It's an interesting question to ask yourself as a coach. If you've played hockey yourself, or actually any sport, which coach did I value the most? And why was that? And then do I show that behavior myself? I mean, for me, it was really easy. I mean, for me, it was the coaches that believed in me. Just that. Had nothing to do with the knowledge, with the training drills we did, completely nothing. Just did they believe in me or not? And that could contain being positive, being constructive, trying to teach me things, all those things. But just that genuine feeling, if I had that, was a great coach for me.
It is a really good question, right? And I think everyone would think that way if they reflected on it properly. The coaches and the teams I love being a part of would have that as a core element. I remember, because I'm a coach, the coaches who in my history who I think were good coaches, the way we trained, the way they talked, the way we planned things, but they're not the coaches necessarily that I remember fondly and loved that part of my journey. It's the coaches that nurtured and rewarded you for doing the things that you were good at and the things that were valued in the team.
Now it's interesting because the most of the players that I actually met, at least in New Zealand, that's different in the Netherlands. They actually, it seems to me that they express that they would value me based upon my knowledge. So is that ignorance, or is that a cultural difference?
I think culturally we do that from a status perspective, and sometimes it's just a label. You're a Black Sticks coach, or you were this, or you or that, and that's how we value things as a society. Sometimes we don't look at what's underneath it. There might be a school coach that's been in the system for 20, 30 years, and I actually know of one, I won't name him, but who's better than a lot of the national coaches, potentially high performance coaches we've had in that same period. But it's a different role, and we don't value them the same because of that sort of status and label we put on people. So that's always a thing that happens, I guess.
Another thing with this stuff is kind of just been actively reflecting on your own behavior. And I find myself a lot of the time having to really get myself in the right state of mind before I go and take on a new group or like a new training. I'm working with five teams this season, and I've got to change my tact for each one depending on what is their value system is in that group. And so I think it's a really cool tool to use as a coach to kind of do a bit of self-talk before your training or before the next game or whatever, so that you get yourself in the right frame and then reflect on that afterwards, so that you're doing the best for your group, that group in particular. So that might be another little tool for coaches out there to just kind of be a little bit more aware and have your emotional intelligence hat on when you're working with your team. So you're looking at what the effect of what you're doing is actually having on your team.
I think that's really
kind of buys into that.
Really important, Jamie, but I think it's bigger than that, because we're busy running into stuff, so it's got to be more than you just checking yourself against that team. That's really important, but it's also, what does the team need right now? We've had this year of, think of one of the teams I've got at the moment who's had stop-start, COVID, tournament cancelled, and you sort of have different periods where it's just keeping things light, and you just got to keep momentum because everyone's mentally cooked from other things that are happening in their life. And then it might be, oh, well, the tournament's on in 3 weeks, and they're drifting a bit and they're a little bit, not switched on. And so you might come into that next session and go, okay, it's time. I've got to subtly just start being more demanding and get them to understand that we've got to find a way to be resilient enough to put all that to the side for a second, or otherwise we're not going to be ready. And so understanding the timeline of your team and where they're at and what they need is an important thing that's got to connect to not just the generic how you need to be for that team because of their age or who they are, etc.
Nice, a really good point. For me, it's I suppose getting the team to kind of come to those realizations, and you're just the guy standing at the front of the orchestra telling the tuba to play, like you're trying to ask them and prompt them to become part of that decision or that movement in your season plan or whatever. So yeah, as we said before, getting their involvement is kind of huge, and they own it. So if they own it, then they're responsible for it.
Yeah, and there is a lot of ownership and empowerment, and we're talking about with all these things with creating a culture and for groups' own growth with that ownership. But as a leader, you can't abdicate times that sometimes there needs to be a sharp message or a bit of a disruption to where they're at the right time. So sometimes, you deliberately need to go in and find things to pick and be demanding. So there's a tone of, okay, yeah, Butch's a bit grumpy today, but okay, I get it. We're running out of time. We've been drifting, and we all agree why, but it's time to go. So you've got to be able to do. It's a bit like play acting. We talked about that with your game day coaching. Sometimes you've got to play act for what your team need, and it can't be how you're feeling or the emotions of them or anything. It's just got to be. This has got to be the tone of today, because that's my job to get us back on track.
Yeah. And that's really an art. That's really an art of knowing when and how to do that, and hoping that the work that you've done with your team, they understand that it's never personal and it's all part of the group, what we need right now.
But that's
Mark, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I mean, I was listening. I mean, you better put me in the audience, because you can do the conversation with the two of you. But I was listening, and you're so right there. I mean, you have to sometimes just push them, as I would say, or challenge them, or set a standard. And that's your role as a coach. But then what you said, Jamie, yeah, you might get some pushback, some frustration. They take it personal, and I think that's the most difficult part of coaching, because I'm not there to make it personal. I mean, not personal in a negative. I'm there to make it personal for the benefit of the whole group, absolutely. But then you get some players that see that understand that. Some need a bit more time, and others don't. And that's where it becomes difficult. So those that don't just want you to be nice and kind to them, but that's impossible as a coach. Yeah, you just have to sort of bear that. You have to digest that. You have to deal with that as a coach. You have to maybe confront them with their behavior. But this is where it becomes really challenging. The theory of Tuckman calls that the conflict phase in the cultural model. Very challenging phase, but a very cool phase too, because if you pursue your values and your mission there, then you can bring the team to great levels.
Yeah, the conflict area is such an important one. I think as Kiwis we try to avoid that. No, I kind of do, but I've seen the importance of it working alongside you, Mark, when we've done some work in the past. Is it really is the secret ingredient to growth, and an emotional response from your group. Even though if you want it to be still in that safe and not too personal, that's going to make someone quit the game, but it really will go on to some large growth if you have an emotional response from your team. I've sat down with teams before and had the real hard, honest conversation, and it did get pretty heated. But the team responded so well after that. They all it bound them even further. Because we all went through that again, a shared experience of not such a nice thing. We did it together and we got through the other side of it, and the effects were positive in that way. So I think conflict is a really important one in terms of growth and in culture as well. Butch, anything to add on that one, mate?
Yeah, I mean, you guys both spoke about it earlier, I think, or maybe there's another conversation. Like, the relationship's key there, right? Because you've got to have a relationship where there's, you want to be part of the team as a coach, because that's sort of why you do it. But there is also a line, and even if you're empowering them and facilitating like as much ownership of everything as possible, and you're just sort of guiding them versus sort of authoritarian, this is how it is approach. You're still the leader, and so there needs to be that line where, yep, we know we care about each other, but I'm the coach. I've got to make decisions, and every now and then I have a responsibility that says, okay, we got to go up a gear, or that's not good enough, or whatever it might be. And the team understands that relationship with how you've crafted it well enough so they understand that, and it's not out of the blue, oh, thought Mark was my mate. And I think then the language is really important as well, because it's not personal. And if you construct that conversation around team and journey and what their goals are, then it's not personal. It's put back to them as a group. It's not about individuals. It's not about us. There's a reason for this, which we all accept, but let's go. And so it's always that art of the strength of your relationship and the context of those relationships and how you create it, and then the language that you use and how you carry yourself in those moments when things are, I guess, changing. Those really important moments where it's not just going along, it's something's changed, and how do you deliver that?
I'm currently working on something that that actually relates to what you're saying, because I agree. It is sometimes you need to push them to go up the next gear. You say, I like that metaphor, and it's not personal, but can they do the same to you? And actually that's something I've started to explore now since a year. I actually want to push my players to do the same with me, because then that's my belief, then they start to understand why I do it. So, and it's also more of a balanced relation, it seems. So yeah, you can push me to do better as a coach, but I also push you to do better as a player. So then we would do better as a squad. And we both learn to do it in a constructive way. You're not there from one week to another week, but yeah, maybe nice to share some of my own learnings in this space.
But also the tone, the structure of training, what you're working on. In a perfect world, you get to a place where that's a two-way conversation for everybody. And we've talked about this before, but the coach for me is no more special than anybody else. We just have different roles to play as one unit, this together thing. And my role's quite different if I'm the head coach than the players. But an assistant coach or manager, we all have different. The goalkeeper, we have different jobs. And once we get clarity around what they are, but that they're all together and all challengeable and all supportable. Not sure if they're all words, but anyway, then we have this sort of thing that basically just supports and grows and manages itself, because we're not relying on one person and nobody is outside of that conversation.
That's great. It's great. It's a great statement.
Yeah. I think, Mark, for what you were saying there, I think you could see that as success in your group if you are getting challenged on things, and it kind of just goes to show that you've built the relationship and they feel comfortable enough to do that and challenge you. And I know that that's what you try and get out of your groups, is that ability for them to come and just have a conversation and challenge, why did we do that? And so this is what I saw. And then you're having an open conversation and you're actually getting somewhere. You're getting ownership, like true ownership from your players then. And for me in teams that I've worked in, if someone comes and has a chat to me after a training about something we've done, I find that as a massive success, because then we're actually training them to think and challenge and do that stuff as well, which makes me better. But also for me is showing that they've learned some leadership and they're part of the group. It's an important thing. So
yeah, because the worst thing is if they do that behind your back as a gossip.
Yeah, it's not really where we want to be, is it? That open and honest, genuine kind of feedback loop is kind of something that you should strive for as a coach, and you can see, it's a successful thing. Butch, you talk a little bit about language and things like that. How can you kind of be consistent with your language throughout a season, and how can you pick the right moments to kind of change your language and have an effect with it?
Well, it's tough for me because I'm such a gypsy. I'm taking this hybrid things that I love and have latched onto and heard. So it's always a bit messy, I think, at the start, because, and my joke is probably a bit laboured now, but when girls or teams don't understand what I'm talking about, I go, oh, we're still working through that Australian accent thing, right? No one laughs anymore, so it's just me saying, I haven't articulated that well or whatever. But language is really important, not just the right type of wording and tone at the right time, but also just with getting clarity around what you're trying to do together. If you use different words or you use too many words, things get lost. But if you really zero in on a couple of key things and you're just repeating them, that's how you create clarity around what's important and what you're trying to do together. And that might shift and change, and it might be a little bit different for each individual. But having that in your mind around what's important for them and for the team, and staying on track with repeating that and rewarding that and using the same words, I think is a really important part of that sort of art of conducting the group into an understood and agreed direction.
Mark, what do you think about language? What kind of tools have you used within your own delivery?
Yeah, so Butch touches on the hockey component. For me, that goes back to principles, and those principles, you repeat in the same language. And there's also the authenticity of myself. So if I feel I can be myself, I'll probably send out constantly the same message, because I'm me, and I act like being me. If sort of being me is jeopardized by, for whatever reason, maybe by the group, conflicting values, different groups within groups, then you start to, maybe be more inconsistent. And that's what you have to watch out for and be careful for as a coach. That could really harm your group process and culture. So being me, truly me, is the most important thing to being consistent for me.
Awesome. That's incredibly powerful, and I think that's a great takeaway for all of our young coaches, old coaches, new coaches. The more you are just yourself, the more genuine it's going to come across to your team. If you show emotions, it's just because you're feeling it. And I think there is a trap of being false. If you're false, then your team picks up on that. That could have a real negative effect on your team culture and that togetherness. So that's really, really strong advice. Think about those things, but also don't go away from just being yourself. Because if you are yourself, you never have to worry about what you say, because you'd probably say the same thing again if you were asked the same question. So
yeah,
very nice.
Yeah.
All right. What we might do is we might just wrap that part of the podcast up, but we're looking to extend this and start looking at some of the application points of this culture and how we can actually start implementing these things with our teams. We have touched on a few things today, which I'm sure you can all take away and use. But in the next podcast, we'll be looking at some of the tools for coaches to help build strong cultures and being in it together and things like that. So thanks very much for your time today, boys. We'll catch up again in a week or so and nut out the rest of this really fascinating topic of culture and togetherness. And as you've seen, if you look around in the sporting world, some of the most successful teams that have gone on for long periods of time of success, like the Crusaders, the Bulls, they have an underlying value system and culture that has bred that success, and it's a long-term success. Things that have happened for a long period of time that kind of lead to those results. I think that's super important to take away, that the stuff doesn't happen overnight. It's built, and groups only get that connected nature after being together for a certain amount of time. So ponder that one while you're listening to this, and look forward to the next podcast. Any closing comments?
No, I really enjoyed the conversation, and there's lots of other things, no doubt, that we've missed, we haven't been able to get to. It's a fascinating and important area, not just culture and how you help influence that, but also, as we touched on a couple of times, I think there's another layer around teams that are really truly connected, on top of just having good culture and an agreed way of doing things. It is the most important thing, as you said at the start.
Nice.
Yeah, we have missed a lot because this is such a great topic, and there's so much to tell, but we also have captured quite a few good essences of things. So I'm quite happy to leave it here for now.
Excellent. Well, thanks again for your time, gentlemen. I will look forward to catching up over a coffee with you shortly. Cheers. Thanks a lot for listening. We hope you enjoyed the Hockey New Zealand Exploring Coaching podcast. We encourage you to take the time and identify a couple of things that resonated with you that you can apply to your own coaching practice. We look forward to having you on board for our next podcast too, so keep an eye on the Hockey New Zealand website for more information.